He said he loved me. Then he pointed a gun at my face and told me to sign. No warning, no explanation. Just a prenup shoved into my hands and a barrel pressed against my forehead. I still remember how steady his voice was. Like this was normal. Like threatening your fiancé at gunpoint was just another step in wedding prep. It's just business, he said. You'll thank me later. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I signed, because back then I still thought I loved him too. Back then, I still believed the lies. He was the man everyone wanted, rich, handsome, charming, a walking success story with perfect teeth and the kind of confidence that made you feel lucky just to stand next to him. He swept me off my feet in less than a month. Designer gifts, private jets, champagne brunches in places most people only see on postcards. So when he proposed, I said yes, but what I didn't know was that the ring came with strings, and a prenup designed to leave me with absolutely nothing. No house, no money, not even the shoes he bought me. It was all spelled out in black and white, and I signed it with a gun to my head, literally. And now he's broke. Now he's knocking on my door begging for rent money. Now he's the one on his knees and I'm the one holding the pen. When I first met Damien, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. He wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of rich that didn't need to say it out loud. The kind of rich that you saw in the way he carried himself, in the quiet confidence of someone who didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He drove a charcoal gray Aston Martin and wore watches that cost more than my yearly income. But it wasn't the money that got me not at first. It was how effortlessly he made everyone in the room pay attention. He didn't dominate conversations. He controlled them. His voice was calm, low, deliberate, like he already knew the ending to every story before you finished the first sentence. And when he looked at me, I swear it was like no one else existed. Not in that rooftop bar, not in the city, not on the planet, just me. We met at a charity event hosted by one of my clients. I was doing social media management at the time, freelance work, small businesses mostly. One of them invited me to tag along, said it would be a good networking opportunity. I almost didn't go. I'd just finished a 14-hour day, and my idea of a Saturday night was usually wine and a blanket on the couch. But something told me to dress up and show up. That something turned into Damien Anderson. He approached me with a drink in one hand and a knowing smirk like he'd been waiting for me all evening. "Let me guess," he said. "You're not actually supposed to be here." I raised an eyebrow, amused. "And what makes you think that?" He leaned in slightly. "Because you're the only one here who isn't pretending." I laughed, a little thrown off, but intrigued. He was smooth, too smooth, but I told myself he was just confident. That's what rich men were like, right? Direct, efficient, certain. That night, he asked for my number. I gave it. By the next evening, he'd sent me a reservation confirmation. For dinner 7:30 p.m., French place in Midtown with 3 Michelin stars. I showed up 15 minutes early and he was already there, seated, drink in hand, phone nowhere in sight. He stood up as soon as he saw me and pulled my chair out like we were in some black and white movie. He didn't rush through the meal. He didn't check his watch. He listened, really listened. Asked about my childhood, my goals, my freelance work, even my favorite book. And when the waiter brought the check, Damien didn't even look at it. Just handed over his card, casually asked, "Dessert here, or should we take a walk?" We ended up walking through the city until nearly midnight, passing storefronts and closed cafes, laughing about things that didn't seem that funny in the daylight. And when he dropped me off at my apartment, he didn't try to come up. He just kissed the back of my hand and said, "Let me know when you want to do this again." I should have known right then. No man is that perfect without a catch. The next few weeks felt like I was living someone else's life. Damien had a driver, a full-time chef, a doorman who greeted me like I lived there. And soon, I kind of did. He cleared out a drawer for me. In his closet, then it turned into half the dresser. Then a key. Then I was practically moved in. No conversation, no label, just this slow, seamless transition into a new reality. One where my old life felt like a distant memory. I barely noticed how fast things were moving because everything felt so easy. Too easy. Every morning there was coffee already brewed. Every night dinner appeared like magic. And Damien never raised his voice, never lost his temper. But that didn't mean he wasn't controlling. Looking back, I realize how subtle it was, how carefully he constructed this version of us, where everything was perfect, as long as I followed his rhythm. The playlist never changed. The people we saw were always his. If I brought up wanting to host my friends, he'd smile and say, "Of course." But then something would come up. Urgent meeting, bad timing, "Not tonight, babe." And then came the talks about marriage. It started small. He'd drop comments like, "Can you imagine us doing this in Paris our honeymoon?" Or, I bet you'd look unreal in a white dress. It wasn't a question, it was an inevitability. I didn't even realize we'd skipped the part where people usually talk about what they want. He just assumed I was on board. And I went along with it. Why wouldn't I on the outside? It was a dream. Lavish weekends, private events, people who treated me like royalty just because I was with him. I was the envy of every woman I knew, and I'd convinced myself I was lucky. So when he proposed, it wasn't even a surprise. It happened at an exclusive gala, of course. Black tie, a spotlight. A gasp from the crowd as Damien pulled a velvet box from his pocket and knelt down like some DMN prince. I said yes. The applause was deafening. But in the middle of all that noise, I felt something tighten in my chest. I ignored it until the prenup. He waited until we were packing for a surprise trip the following weekend. He told me to grab my passport, and when I turned around, he was sitting on the edge of the bed with a folder in his lap. Before we go, he said, just one little thing to handle. Inside was a prenup. So cold, so calculated, I had to read it twice to make sure I wasn't missing something. No shared assets, no alimony, no gifts retained. Not even the condo we were living in, his name only. It said I'd walk away with exactly what I brought into the marriage, which was nothing. I laughed nervously. You're kidding, right? That's when he opened the drawer, pulled out the gun, and laid it on the table, not pointed, just resting there. But the message was crystal clear. You think I got this far in life by being careless, he said? Just sign it. It's a formality. You're not marrying me for money, right? That was the first moment I realized I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even blink. I picked up the pen with a hand that barely trembled and signed my name at the bottom of the document. The same name I'd dreamed of writing next to his on wedding invitations, future mortgages, even baby announcements. But now, it was inked onto a trap, a legally binding blueprint of my own erasure. He watched me the entire time, his face unreadable, like this was just another business deal he had to get done before dinner. Once I finished signing, he smiled. Not warm, not grateful, just ... satisfied, like he'd locked something into place. He slid the paper back into the folder and tucked it under his arm like it was nothing more than a hotel checkout form. Perfect, he said, standing up. Now we can relax. It's going to be a great weekend. And just like that, he picked up his phone, texted the driver, and asked if I wanted Thai or sushi for dinner. That was Damien. That was always Damien. He had this ability to over anything uncomfortable and pretend nothing happened, like he could will reality into obedience just by ignoring it hard enough. And for a while, I let him. We flew to the Maldives the next morning. First class, of course, champagne before takeoff, seats that reclined into beds, staff that greeted him by name. Everything looked perfect from the outside, and I knew that. If I told anyone, if I said, he made me sign a prenup with a gun on the table, they'd look at me like I was overreacting, like I was making a drama out of nothing, because that's what he did. He painted everything in soft colors. .com, voices and cold logic. No yelling, no bruises. Just manipulation dressed up in designer suits. At the resort, we had a private villa with a pool that spilled into the ocean and glass floors that showed the coral below. He posted photos of us smiling at sunset, holding hands at dinner. My DM exploded with comments. You're so lucky. Relationship goals? When he looks at you like that, I replied to none of them. Every time I looked at him, all I saw was the moment the barrel of that gun kissed the edge of the table, not aimed, not cocked, but present, heavy and full of meaning. I kept quiet. That was my mistake, because silence feeds control. After we got back from the trip, things didn't improve, they just got quieter. The warmth he once showed me cooled fast. He didn't yell, that wasn't his style. Instead, he started delegitimizing my presence 1 inch at a time. First, he added locks to certain rooms in the penthouse, his office, his study, work stuff, he said. Confidential. Then he stopped inviting me to events. Too many investors, he'd say, you'd be bored. He began vetting my outfits under the guise of styling tips. That dress doesn't match the tone of this place. Or try something. More muted, less attention-grabbing. Then came the finances. I used to have access to our shared account, his account that he gave me access to. One day, the card declined. He said it was a mistake, that the fraud department must have flagged it, but it kept happening. And soon, he started giving me envelopes of cash like I was a personal assistant on salary. That's when I realized that prenup hadn't been paranoia on his part, it was a strategy. He didn't want a partner, he wanted control. And now that I was legally bound to him with zero rights to his wealth, he could pull every string and watch me dance. But I didn't dance. I watched, I listened. I started collecting details, subtle ones. I saved receipts. I made copies of documents when he wasn't looking. I even created a hidden bank account under my maiden name and began stashing whatever cash I could squirrel away from the envelopes. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was something. I knew I had to leave, but I also knew I couldn't just walk out the door. Not without a plan, not without a backup. He'd made it very clear what he was capable of, and I wasn't stupid. I'd seen the way he looked at people who defied him. Then, almost like fate, I didn't have to make the next move because the world made it for me. One morning, I woke up to the sound of Damien cursing in the hallway, sharp-clipped words, not loud but vibrating. With tension, he was on the phone. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was enough. "What do you mean it's frozen?" "Of course I didn't authorize that transfer. That's *T, and you know it. You have no idea who you're messing with." I didn't ask questions, I just waited. And 2 days later, I found out what had happened. His company was under investigation for securities fraud. Multiple shell corporations, off the books, payments. A whistleblower had come forward. Suddenly, the money that had built our kingdom was disappearing. Fast, his cars were repossessed. His name hit financial news headlines with the word criminal inquiry dancing right behind it. He came crawling to me. Same man who once waved a gun to get my signature now stood in the kitchen asking me for rent money. No threats, no suits, just pajamas, unshaven face, and a mug of reheated coffee. "I just need a few weeks to get back on my feet," he said, like nothing had ever happened. "You're still my wife, right?" I stared at him and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. He moved through the house like a ghost after that, quiet, hollow-eyed and bitter in ways he didn't even try to hide. The suit-wearing, empire-running version of Damien had completely vanished. In his place was a man who looked like he'd been dragged through a storm and never quite dried off. He stayed in bed till noon, shuffled around barefoot, and spent most evenings staring at his laptop with the same expression someone might wear at a funeral. Only difference was, he wasn't grieving anyone, he was grieving the loss of control. For the first time in our entire relationship, he needed me, and he hated that I didn't offer to help. I didn't ask what was happening with the legal case. I didn't even ask if he'd eaten. I made my own coffee, took my freelance calls in the sunroom, and treated him like what he'd become. A stranger who just happened to live in the same space. I should have felt guilty. I didn't, not even a little. Because here's the truth, no one ever tells you being emotionally neglected for years doesn't just chip away at your love. It annihilates it, slowly, quietly, until one day you look at the man you once adored, and all you feel is nothing. That's what Damien had done to me. And now, sitting there in sweatpants that didn't fit and asking to borrow my Wi-Fi password, he finally looked small enough for me to see him clearly. The man who once made me believe I'd won the lottery wasn't powerful. He wasn't even confident, he was just good at performing. What was underneath wasn't scary, it was pathetic. Still, I kept my distance. He hadn't apologized. Not once. Not for the prenup. Not for the gun. Not for turning our marriage into a psychological prison. Instead, he pretended like those things hadn't happened. Like we were just going through a rough patch, and eventually we'd both laugh about it over wine on the balcony. The delusion was almost impressive. One night, I walked into the kitchen and caught him searching through my purse. He flinched when he saw me. I didn't even let him finish. I grabbed my bag and walked straight back to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. That was the first time I started recording. I'd set up an app on my phone that would auto-record any time it heard loud voices. I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. Not if he snapped. Not if things escalated. I didn't trust him, not in the slightest, and it didn't take long for the mask to slip again. When the eviction notice arrived, his penthouse had a lien on it due to unpaid property taxes. I watched him crumble. He slammed the door so hard it cracked the wall, punched the kitchen cabinet and left a dent in the wood, shouted at no one, then at me. "This is your fault," he said, pointing a trembling finger. "You were supposed to support me." "What kind of wife lets her husband fall apart like this?" I raised an eyebrow. "The kind that was held at gunpoint before the honeymoon." He flinched, just for a second, but I saw it. That tiny flicker of fear when he realized I wasn't scared of him anymore. I wasn't his puppet. I wasn't his project. I wasn't even his wife in the way he defined it. I was done. I started sleeping with the bedroom door locked every night. Kept pepper spray on the nightstand, moved my laptop, my cash stash, and my passport into a locked cabinet. I was ready to go the second he pushed too far. But instead of exploding, he imploded. Damien started spiraling in the most pitiful ways imaginable. Posting Instagram photos from years ago, trying to pretend nothing had changed. Uploading videos of him giving motivational business talks that were clearly filmed in the living room. Sending mass emails to old clients, begging for investment in a new venture he hadn't even created yet. And worst of all, he kept trying to rope me into it. "You're good at writing," he said one morning, pouring himself coffee he didn't pay for. "Why don't you help me draft a pitch deck?" I looked at him like he'd just suggested I build him a rocket ship. "No." His smile twitched. "You don't have to be rude." I leaned in slightly. "You pointed a gun at me. If I'm being rude, consider it restrained." That shut him up. For a little while, but the turning point came a week later. He got drunk. Not buzzed. Not tipsy. Obliterated. It was 2 a.m. when I heard him screaming from the balcony. When I got up to see what the noise was, he was standing in his underwear, holding a bottle of whiskey and yelling at the skyline like it had personally betrayed him. "I built this city," he shouted. "I made people rich. I was a king. And now look at me begging, my maid for F***, CKing rent. Maid. That's what I was to him now. Not a partner, not a wife. A maid. A convenience. I walked out onto the balcony, stood right beside him, and said one word. "Move." He turned, confused. I held up my phone, recording. He blinked at it, dazed. "I've got your voice, your slurs, your confession, all of it," I said. "Keep going. Say more. Make it easier." He went pale. "You're threatening me." "No," I said. "I'm protecting myself. Something you never thought I'd learn to do." And I walked back inside, shut the balcony door behind me, and left him out there with his whiskey and his wounded ego. The next morning, I sent the recording to a lawyer, not to press charges. Not yet, but just to have it on file, because I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. When Damien finally realized I wasn't going to bail him out, something in him snapped for good. The shift wasn't loud, it was slow, seeping in like rot. He stopped asking nicely, stopped pretending to care about appearances. He went from passive-aggressive remarks to full-on emotional blackmail, the kind that doesn't come with bruises. Just silence, guilt, and the kind of pressure that makes you second-guess your own memories. "You wouldn't even be here without me," he said one evening, as I was folding laundry. "I built this life, you just lived in it." I didn't respond. I'd learned not to. Arguing gave him fuel, but that night I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun useless circles, replaying all the little ways he had chipped away at my sense of self until I barely recognized the woman who used to laugh easily and make plans without permission. But I wasn't her anymore. I was something else now, hardened, focused. The eviction notice gave us 30 days to vacate the penthouse. I had already been working on my exit long before that letter showed up, but now the clock was ticking. He, on the other hand, was unraveling fast. Every day became a parade of shame. One afternoon he came home with grocery bags full of instant noodles and off-brand toiletries. "You wanted independence?" he sneered, slamming them on the counter. "Here's what it looks like." I looked at the sad pile of discount soap and canned soup and thought, this is what you've been reduced to, petty tantrums in the clearance aisle. But what I didn't expect was what came next. One evening I walked into the living room to find Damien watching Minot in the usual angry, accusing way. "Not since the holidays." He nodded slowly, eyes not leaving mine. "You know, it'd be a real shame if something confidential got leaked about your business dealings." I almost laughed. People are petty. Clients get nervous. A little doubt goes a long way. There it was. The threat. Not overt. Never overt. That wasn't Damien's style. He liked to keep things clean, quiet, deniable. It was how he built his empire. It was also how he destroyed people. But this time, he wasn't the only one playing the game. I didn't reply. Just turned around and walked straight to my room, heart pounding, brain spinning through scenarios. I didn't know if he had anything on me, doubtful, but it didn't matter. The point wasn't the threat itself. It was about control, reminding me he could still ruin me if he wanted to. What he didn't know was that I had already started gathering everything I needed to ruin him. I had files, recordings, text messages, the prenup copy, voice notes he forgot he sent, emails from previous employees he'd belittled and underpaid. There was a whole trail of quietly damning material sitting on an encrypted drive, waiting for the right moment. I didn't plan on using IT unless I had to. That moment came sooner than I expected. 1 week before move-out day, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I picked up, a woman's voice asked, "Are you Mrs. Anderson?" I hesitated. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Detective Alvarez with the Financial Crimes Division. We're reaching out in regard to a new development in Mr. Damien Anderson's case." My heart slowed to a crawl. "Sure," I said calmly. The next morning, I met her at a local precinct. She was polite, direct, and clearly not there for small talk. Apparently, Damien had been shifting funds through international shell companies for over 3 years. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she clarified, but we're aware you were legally connected to him during this period. If there's anything you can offer us, it could help your own record stay clean." I didn't hesitate. I told her everything. Not just about the fraud, but the prenup, the coercion, the threats, the gun. I even showed her a copy of the video I'd recorded from the balcony. With Damien screaming about me being his maid and confessing to the rent, she asked if I would be willing to provide more documentation. I said yes. I sent the encrypted files. All of them. By the time I left that office, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because it was over, far from it. And once you speak, you don't go. Back to silence 2 days later. But the minute they mentioned wire fraud, he started unraveling. "This is a misunderstanding," he insisted. "My wife's wife, she's setting me up. She's vindictive. They didn't care." He was handcuffed right in front of me, barefoot, with unshaved stubble and a t-shirt stained with soy sauce. He looked nothing like the man who once controlled boardrooms and manipulated my every step. And as he was being walked out, "This is just cleanup." He didn't say another word. As soon as the door closed, I locked it, exhaled, and collapsed onto the floor. Not because I was sad, not because I was scared, but because for the first time I realized what peace might actually feel like, and it was quiet. Really, beautifully quiet. The silence after Damien was arrested wasn't just the absence of his footsteps, or the end of his passive-aggressive muttering. It was something deeper and emotional quiet. Like the moment right after a thunderstorm when everything feels washed, clean, and a little raw. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even cry. I just sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the detritus of a life we'd built on manipulation and pretense, and finally let my body unclench. It wasn't over, not legally, not emotionally, but he was gone, and that was enough to start with. What followed was a blur of paperwork, legal calls, and packing. The lawyer I'd quietly hired months ago moved fast, securing emergency motions to separate our finances and remove me from anything that could be used against me in court. I wasn't a suspect. I was a survivor, and yet the real trial was internal. There was something humiliating about explaining your own life to strangers, especially when that life sounds like a dramatic soap opera. I could see the flickers of surprise in their faces when I spoke plainly. Yes, he forced me to sign a prenup at gunpoint. No, I never reported it. Yes, I stayed. No, I'm not proud. But when you've been gaslit for years, survival doesn't look like screaming, it looks like silence. It looks like adaptation. The day I finally left the penthouse for good, I didn't bring much. Just 2 suitcases, a folder of important documents, and a flash drive of all the evidence I'd gathered. Shoes, the jewelry he'd given me as apologies, felt tainted. They belonged to a different version of me. One who had spent years negotiating with fear just to feel normal. I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment across town. Nothing glamorous, but it had sunlight and quiet neighbors, and a landlord who gave me a discount because I paid 6 months. Up front, freedom wasn't luxurious, but it was mine. And that alone made it feel like a palace. For the first time in years, I set my own schedule. I rearranged the furniture however I wanted. I cooked when I felt like it. I left dishes in the sink overnight without guilt. My freelance work picked up. Word had gotten around that I was out of that mess. And suddenly old clients started resurfacing, people I hadn't heard from in years, now reaching out to offer projects. I got a message from someone I hadn't expected to ever hear from again, Serena. Damien's ex-girlfriend, the one he always compared me to, idolized, held up as some perfect memory I could never match. She had moved to London years ago and disappeared from his life, or so I thought. Her message was short, just one line. "I've heard what happened. I believe you." At first I thought it was a mistake, a prank. But then she followed up with a voice note. Her voice was calm, a little sad. I ran before it got worse. But I always wondered what would have happened if I stayed. I wasn't weak. I had just been caught in a cycle someone else had barely escaped. We talked more after that, not often. But when we did, it was like comparing scars. Quiet validation in every sentence. A career pivot, and now she was thriving. That's what I was building. But Damien wasn't done. From jail, he tried to write me letters. The first one arrived 3 weeks after his arrest. A neatly folded apology on monogrammed paper, as if branding still mattered behind bars. He begged for forgiveness, blamed the stress, said I was the only one who ever truly saw him. I didn't reply. The second letter was angrier, more desperate. He called me a traitor, accused me of ruining his life, said the media frenzy was my fault. He didn't see me as a person, just a reflection of his success or failure. I had my lawyer issue a no-contact request. Then came the interview offers. Producers, podcasters, even one documentary team. "Your story is powerful," they said. "It could help other women." And maybe it could, but I wasn't ready to be anyone's symbol. Not yet. Instead, I started writing privately. Not for profit. Not for likes, just to understand myself. Again, I wrote about the early years, the charm, the promises, the slow erosion of my independence. I wrote about the prenup, the gun, the moment I stopped loving him, found people. Eventually, I even started dating again, cautiously, slowly. I met a man named Malcolm at an author reading, an older gentleman with the kind of voice that sounded like worn leather and warm whiskey. He asked me about the book, not my body. Asked me what made me feel safe, not what made me feel sexy. When I laughed at his jokes, it wasn't forced. When he touched my hand, it wasn't possessive. He never asked about Damien, but when I told him eventually on my own terms, he didn't blink, just said, "Thank you for telling me," and asked if I wanted to go dancing. I said yes, not because I needed a new man to fill the space the last one left, but because I no longer feared being seen or loved or left. If Malcolm left tomorrow, I'd still be whole. That was the difference now. My worth wasn't contingent on what someone gave me, it came from within. Built brick by brick, through every scar, every silence, every time I said no and meant it. I had become a woman who no longer performed to be palatable. I spoke my mind, walked away when things didn't sit right, and laughed loudly, unapologetically, like the mural I sat across from every Thursday morning. Eventually, I started writing about what I'd been through, not to relive it, but to reclaim it. I pitched an essay to a publication I admired. Under a pseudonym at first, they published it, then asked for another. Soon my inbox filled with messages from women all over the world. Some said, "I thought I was crazy until I read this." Others simply wrote, "Thank you." I didn't respond to them all. I couldn't, but I read every single one. And when I finally decided to put my real name on a piece, my first name, not his, I didn't hesitate, because the shame was never mine. It had never belonged to me. And hiding from it meant letting him win in silence. I was done with silence by the time Damien's sentencing made the evening news. No one called to ask if I was okay. My friends knew I was. They were in my living room that night, sipping wine and arguing about what country we should visit next: Bali, Morocco, Iceland. Someone mentioned a month-long artist residency. Someone else said we should just rent a van and drive aimlessly through the mountains. I didn't need closure anymore because I was living in the open, because I'd rebuilt not just a life but myself. Damien, for all his power, all his money, all his threats, had never imagined a world where I existed without him. That was his fatal mistake. He thought signing a prenup at gunpoint would lock me into his story forever, but it was actually the start of mine. Now, when I pass women who look unsure, who keep glancing at their phones like they're afraid of missing a message or stepping out of line, I want to reach out. I want to say, it doesn't have to be like this. You don't owe anyone your silence, your comfort, or your freedom. But most of the time, I don't say anything. I just make space. I sit with my friends in cafes and laugh. I write in my journal and dance barefoot on my balcony. I go on long walks without texting anyone where I'm going, because freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet moments you no longer have to explain. And if that's not closure, I don't know what is.